Harold Bennett stopped the wedding before Mei Lin reached the altar. "Take those decorations down," he barked across the crowded church hall, while snow hammered the windows hard enough to rattle the glass frames. Every voice disappeared instantly. Mei Lin froze in the center aisle, still holding the dark red wedding shawl her late father once carried during winter horse trading journeys across the frontier. The groom never stepped toward her. That hurt worse than the shouting. Another stable lost horses before dawn. Harold continued loudly enough for the entire town to hear. Every ranch touched by her father's cures ends up cursed sooner or later. Several people immediately moved away from Mei Lin without thinking. Others lowered their eyes toward the floor. Mei Lin tried speaking once. "The sickness spread before my father ever arrived there." "Enough," Harold snapped. "Your family always arrives after trouble starts, then leaves before the dying begins." The words struck harder, because deep down, Mei Lin already feared they were true. 10 minutes later, she walked alone through blinding snow, carrying one cloth bag and the untouched wedding shawl, while church bells still rang behind her for a marriage that no longer existed. By midnight, the storm buried Caleb Turner's ranch under ice and wind. Another horse had collapsed before sunset. Caleb already knew the sound of death inside his stable now because he had buried 3 animals this winter alone. He entered the barn expecting silence and immediately heard movement near the back stalls instead. Lantern raised high, Caleb stopped cold. A young woman slept curled beside his weakest horse, with her arms wrapped gently around its neck, while steam lifted from a small iron pot nearby. "Get away from that animal," Caleb ordered sharply. Mei Lin woke instantly, but reached towards the horse before protecting herself. "His breathing slows if he stays warm," she answered quickly. Caleb noticed strange details at once. Herbs floating inside heated water, clean cloth wrapped around swollen joints, fresh straw replaced beneath the horse. The stable smelled cleaner near her stall than anywhere else in the barn. "Who are you?" Caleb demanded. Mei Lin hesitated briefly before answering. Tiny crack. "Someone people usually ask to leave once things stop dying." That sentence unsettled Caleb more than the storm outside because it sounded practiced. Before he could respond, the horse beneath her suddenly pushed itself upright for the first time in 2 days. Caleb stared in disbelief, while the animal steadied weakly against the stall rail. Mei Lin lowered exhausted eyes afterward, as if expecting accusation instead of surprise. "There are 4 more sick ones," she whispered quietly. "If you still want me gone, wait until morning." Caleb looked past her towards the remaining stalls, where restless horses slowly began rising one after another beneath the lantern light. And for the first time all winter, the barn no longer sounded like a place preparing for death. Caleb walked into the barn before sunrise, expecting another dead horse, and stopped so suddenly the lantern nearly slipped from his hand. Every sick animal stood awake inside the stalls, not healed completely, not strong, but standing. The black gelding that collapsed yesterday now pushed impatiently against the feed gate, while steam rolled steadily from its nose instead of the weak, rattling breath Caleb heard for weeks. Wade Mercer entered moments later carrying a shovel for burial duty and froze beside him. "That horse was dying yesterday," Wade muttered quietly. Caleb looked towards the back stall, where Mei Lin sat asleep against a hay bale beside an empty water bucket, her hands still wrapped in damp medicine cloths. She looked worse than the horses now. Pale face, wet hair half fallen from its braid, red, swollen fingers from carrying heated water through freezing wind all night. Caleb crossed the barn slowly and noticed another unsettling detail. Every stall had been cleaned during the night. Sick bedding replaced. Feed measured carefully instead of dumped hurriedly. Water buckets warmed with heated stones underneath to stop freezing. Somebody had not merely treated horses here. Somebody had cared whether they suffered. "Wake her," Wade whispered. Caleb nudged the overturned bucket gently with his boot. Mei Lin startled awake instantly and reached toward the nearest horse before realizing where she was. Instinct before awareness. Caleb noticed that immediately. "The fever broke before dawn," she said quickly, while standing too fast and grabbing the stall rail afterward. Tiny crack. Exhaustion slipping through. Wade stared openly now. "What exactly did you give them?" Mei Lin hesitated. "Warm water first," she answered quietly. "Cold animals stop fighting to live." The sentence landed strangely heavy in the stable. By noon, the recovered horses became ranch gossip across 3 neighboring properties. 2 ranch hands arrived pretending they came to inspect fencing damage from the storm, though both spent most of their time staring at Mei Lin while she moved calmly between the stalls changing medicine cloths. One finally muttered near the doorway, "Maybe the Bennett family threw out the wrong person." Mei Lin heard it. Caleb noticed, because her hands paused briefly over the horse brush before continuing again. Tiny crack. Not relief. Fear. That evening, Caleb climbed the loft stairs above the barn carrying fresh blankets and found Mei Lin quietly folding the same cloth bag she carried from the wedding. "You planning to leave already?" he asked. Mei Lin kept tying the bag carefully without meeting his eyes. "People usually stop wanting me around once things improve." Caleb frowned slightly at that because she spoke the sentence too naturally, too often. "The horses aren't better yet," he replied flatly. Mei Lin finally looked at him then. "They will be." Caleb stayed silent for a second longer than intended, because suddenly the stable below sounded alive again for the first time in months, and the thought of that silence returning unsettled him more than another sick horse ever had. Finally, he set the blankets beside her and said quietly, "Then stay until they are." Mei Lin stared at him afterward with the cautious expression of someone who no longer trusted temporary kindness enough to believe it lasted beyond disaster. The barn roof collapsed during the second storm of February. Caleb woke to the violent crack of splitting timber and reached the stable fast enough to see snow pouring through the western rafters, while terrified horses slammed against their stall doors trying to break free. "Move the chestnut mare first," Mei Lin shouted through the chaos before Caleb could even grab the lead ropes. "If she panics, the others follow." Caleb obeyed instantly, though the realization unsettled him afterward because he had spent years refusing instructions from anyone inside his own stable. By sunrise, half the roof sagged inward under heavy snow, forcing workers to move several horses into the equipment shed and leaving the upstairs loft above the barn unsafe to sleep in. "She can stay in the house until repairs finish," Wade Mercer suggested, while helping nail temporary supports into place. Then he lowered his voice slightly near Caleb. "Town's already talking anyway." Caleb frowned. "Talking about what?" Wade gave him a look. "A rejected bride sleeping alone at your ranch while your horses suddenly recover." The words lingered unpleasantly long after Wade rode home. That evening, Mei Lin entered the ranch house carrying only her cloth bag and medicine satchel, while wind rattled the shutters outside. Caleb expected awkward silence after that. Instead, the house changed almost immediately. Mei Lin lit the stove before dark. Soup simmered instead of a cold coffee sitting untouched on counters. Damp gloves appeared drying beside the fire, before Caleb realized he left them near the door. Small things. Dangerous things. The second hook came 3 nights later when Caleb returned from checking frozen fence lines and found ranch workers still sitting inside the kitchen, laughing quietly over fresh bread, while Mei Lin repaired torn saddle blankets beside the stove. Months earlier, those same men avoided the house entirely after work, because the place felt too empty to stay inside longer than necessary. Wade noticed Caleb standing silently near the doorway and smirked slightly. "Your ranch stopped feeling cursed," he muttered while pulling his coat on to leave. Mei Lin lowered her eyes toward the sewing needle after hearing that. Tiny crack. She still reacted to words like cursed before hiding it again. The third hook arrived near midnight. Caleb rode through worsening snow searching for a missing foal trapped somewhere near the lower river crossing, and returned hours later soaked with ice along his coat sleeves. The kitchen lantern still burned beside the window, waiting for him. Caleb stepped inside, expecting everyone asleep already, and stopped short near the table. Mei Lin had fallen asleep upright in the chair beside untouched soup. With one hand still resting near dried medicine cloths, she prepared for the injured foal. She must have waited hours listening for his horse outside. Caleb stood there longer than necessary, watching the warm kitchen glow around her exhausted face before the floorboard creaked under his boot. Mei Lin woke instantly and looked toward him before fully opening her eyes. "Did the foal survive?" she asked immediately. Caleb stared at her quietly because nobody had waited awake for him in that house for years. And suddenly, the storm outside felt far less dangerous than the realization slowly settling inside him. The ranch was no longer simply recovering from sickness anymore. It was beginning to belong to someone again. By the end of winter, neighboring ranchers started arriving at Caleb Turner's property before sunrise, carrying injured horses they once would have shot rather than treat. And Caleb noticed the strangest part immediately. Most of them spoke to Mei Lin before speaking to him now. The stable no longer sounded like a dying place. Horses stamped impatiently against fresh straw. Workers laughed while repairing tack near the open doors. Even the old black gelding that nearly collapsed during the storm followed Mei Lin across the yard like a loyal dog whenever she carried feed buckets. "Never seen animals trust somebody that fast," Wade Mercer muttered one morning while watching a frightened colt calm the moment Mei Lin touched its neck. Caleb almost answered before another wagon rolled into the yard, carrying trouble instead of customers. A wealthy horse buyer from Carson Ridge climbed down beside the stable and immediately frowned after noticing Mei Lin near the stalls. "This the Chinese woman everyone's talking about?" he asked loudly enough for the workers to hear. Caleb's expression hardened instantly. "You came to buy horses or gossip?" The man ignored him and walked toward the recovering mare near the fence. "Heard she fixes animals until they relapse later." Several workers went silent after that because the rumor already spread through nearby towns over the past week. Mei Lin heard every word while preparing medicine water beside the stable door, though her hands only paused for half a second before continuing again. Tiny crack, Caleb noticed immediately. "You got proof of that?" Wade asked sharply. The buyer shrugged. "People don't reject brides publicly unless something's wrong." The stable atmosphere tightened at once. Caleb stepped forward slowly enough that even the horses sensed the change. "Then maybe the problem was the people," he said flatly. The buyer laughed once under his breath. "You willing to risk your entire ranch reputation over her?" Caleb looked toward the healthy horses filling the yard before answering. "Already did." Silence hit the stable harder than shouting. The buyer eventually purchased 2 horses anyway before leaving, though the poison of the rumor stayed behind after his wagon disappeared down the road. That evening, Caleb found Mei Lin alone near the rear stalls brushing the black gelding long after work ended. You didn't have to say that, she said quietly without looking up. Caleb leaned against the stall doorway. He was wrong. Mei Lin's brushing slowed slightly. Doesn't matter, she replied softly. People usually decide what I am before they decide whether I helped. The sentence settled heavily between them, because this time Caleb finally heard the deeper wound beneath her calmness. Mei Lin did not fear insults anymore. She feared becoming temporary the moment life stopped falling apart around her. Later that night, while hanging his coat near the stairs, Caleb noticed something small but dangerous sitting beside the kitchen stove. Mei Lin had unpacked folded clothes from the cloth bag and placed them carefully into the cabinet drawer, instead of leaving them ready near the door. She froze briefly after realizing he noticed. Another tiny crack. Then quietly, almost cautiously, she pushed the empty travel bag deeper beneath the bed, where it could no longer be reached quickly during the night. The rumor spread faster than the horse fever ever had. By the second week of March, ranchers arriving at Caleb Turner's property no longer asked only whether Mei Lin could heal sick animals. They quietly asked how long the horses stayed healthy afterward. Caleb noticed the damage immediately, because workers who once laughed freely inside the stable now watched customers more carefully whenever Mei Lin passed nearby, almost waiting for doubt to return. Then the first real blow landed. One recovered mare collapsed during a buyer inspection near noon. The frightened animal kicked violently against the stable rail while 3 customers backed away at once. I knew this wouldn't last, one muttered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Caleb reached the stall first, but Mei Lin was already kneeling beside the horse, checking its breathing with frightening calm. "Move everyone back," she ordered sharply. The authority in her voice silenced the barn faster than shouting could have. Mei Lin checked the mare's legs, jaw, then feed bucket before finally exhaling once. "Not fever," she said quietly. "Spoiled grain." Relief moved through the workers immediately, but the buyers stayed uneasy because fear spreads easier than truth. "Maybe the sickness never left," another man whispered near the doorway. Caleb stepped toward him instantly. "Then leave if you're scared." The man actually took one step backward before Wade Mercer interrupted by carrying the spoiled grain sack into the center aisle. "Feed rotted from melted snow water," Wade announced loudly. "Nothing to do with her." The stable slowly relaxed again after that, though Caleb noticed Mei Lin remained unusually quiet long after the buyers left. That evening he found her alone near the river trough, washing medicine cloths in freezing water despite the temperature dropping fast again. "You're going to ruin your hands," Caleb muttered while taking the bucket from her. Mei Lin stayed silent for several seconds before finally speaking. "This is how it starts." Caleb frowned. "What is?" Mei Lin lowered her eyes toward the river current. "People become grateful while things improve, then frightened the moment something goes wrong again." Tiny crack, bigger this time. Caleb waited quietly, sensing more behind the words. Slowly, carefully, Mei Lin finally revealed the full truth. Her father spent years saving horses across struggling territories, other ranchers already abandoned. But when disease spread beyond control one winter, frightened towns blamed the nearest outsider instead of admitting nobody truly understood the sickness itself. "Your fiancé believed them too?" Caleb asked carefully. Mei Lin's expression tightened painfully after hearing that. "Thomas wanted to defend me," she admitted softly. "His father cared more about protecting their reputation publicly." The sentence explained everything Caleb had been slowly understanding since winter began. Mei Lin did not expect love to fail her. She expected fear to. That same night, another horse weakened suddenly during freezing rain, and Mei Lin worked through exhaustion until dawn, trying to stabilize the animal while refusing help from anyone else. Caleb finally found her near sunrise, gripping the stall rail hard enough to stay standing. "You can barely breathe," he said sharply. Mei Lin looked toward the recovering horse instead of him. "If I stop helping when things become difficult," she whispered weakly, "people remember why they blamed me in the first place." Caleb stared at her silently after that because for the first time all winter, he realized Mei Lin wasn't healing horses to prove she was useful anymore. She was trying to outrun abandonment itself. After the spoiled grain incident, Caleb Turner started noticing how often Mei Lin watched people's faces instead of listening to their words. Every time a horse coughed too hard inside the stable, her shoulders tightened slightly before she hit it again. Every delayed wagon or nervous customer pulled the same guarded look across her face, as if she had expected gratitude to vanish the moment trouble returned. Caleb hated recognizing that expression, because somewhere during the winter, he had started carrying the same fear himself. The ranch no longer felt survivable without her in it. The second hook arrived 3 days later, when a neighboring rancher rode into the yard carrying a folded newspaper from Carson Ridge. "Thought you should see this," he muttered awkwardly before handing it to Caleb. Halfway down the page sat a small printed notice. "Thomas Bennett, returning to Miller's Crossing after spring cattle contract." Caleb read the line twice before folding the paper shut again. Wade Mercer noticed immediately. "That the groom?" Caleb gave a short nod. Wade leaned quietly against the fence afterward. "Man usually comes back for one of 2 reasons," he muttered. "Regret or unfinished business." Caleb slept badly that night for the first time in months. The third hook came sooner than expected. Thomas Bennett rode onto the ranch at sunset the very next evening wearing the same dark church coat from the rejected wedding. Mei Lin saw him first while hanging fresh blankets near the stable, and froze so suddenly even the colt beside her stopped moving. "Thomas?" she whispered softly. Caleb felt something tighten hard inside his chest before the man even dismounted. Thomas looked thinner now, tired. Like winter punished him too. His eyes moved slowly across the healthy horses, repaired stable and warm ranch house smoke rising behind them. "I heard stories," he said carefully toward Mei Lin. "Didn't believe them until now." Mei Lin stayed silent. Thomas removed his gloves slowly afterward. "My father was wrong." The words landed heavily because Caleb realized how long Mei Lin waited to hear them from someone. "The sickness reached our ranch anyway," Thomas continued quietly. "We lost half the stable after winter." Mei Lin lowered her eyes briefly after hearing that. Tiny crack. Old pain returning. "I'm sorry for the horses," she answered softly. Not angry, not bitter. Somehow that hurt Caleb more. Thomas stepped closer carefully. "You should have never left town alone that night." Caleb spoke before Mei Lin could answer. "She didn't leave alone. Your town pushed her out." Silence tightened immediately between both men. Thomas looked toward Caleb then, finally understanding something dangerous had changed during the winter. "You planning to keep her hidden here forever?" Caleb answered without hesitation this time. "Nobody's hiding here anymore." The words came harder than intended, because suddenly the fear he avoided for weeks stood directly in front of him, wearing another man's face. Thomas eventually rode away before dark, but the ranch felt fragile afterward, like one wrong sentence could empty it again. Near midnight, Caleb entered the stable, unable to sleep, and stopped beneath the loft ladder. Mei Lin sat alone beside the lantern, quietly repacking the same cloth bag she once unpacked weeks earlier. She did not look surprised seeing him there. Somehow that hurt worst of all. Spring reached Caleb Turner's ranch slowly, then all at once. Snow finally disappeared from the lower pasture. Foals kicked through open fields where silence once sat heavy all winter. And one morning Caleb stepped into the stable, expecting the usual quiet rhythm of work, only to hear workers laughing loudly enough to echo through the rafters again. The ranch no longer sounded wounded. Healthy horses filled the stalls that stood half-empty months earlier. Buyers arrived before breakfast, hoping to reserve spring stock, and smoke rose from the ranch house chimney before dawn every morning because someone inside finally cared enough to warm the place before the day began. Caleb noticed all of it while pretending not to notice the one thing still waiting beside the loft ladder. Mei Lin's cloth bag remained packed. She planned to leave before sunrise tomorrow. The second hook arrived during supper, when Wade Mercer casually asked, "You naming the spring foals yet?" Caleb answered without thinking. May usually names the strong ones first. Silence followed instantly around the table, because it was the first time Caleb spoke about her future at the ranch, as if it naturally belonged there. Mei Lin lowered her eyes toward the soup bowl after hearing it. Tiny crack. Not fear of rejection this time, fear of hoping too much. Long after midnight, Caleb finally made his decision. Before dawn, he walked quietly to the wagon Mei Lin prepared beside the stable, and began unpacking it piece by piece back into the storage room without waking her. The blankets went first, then medicine satchels, then the small cloth bag itself. Caleb carried that one inside personally and folded the red wedding shawl carefully beside the kitchen lantern instead of leaving it packed for another departure. Then he disappeared into the stable before sunrise reached the windows. Mei Lin woke to birds instead of winter wind for the first time in months. She dressed quietly, expecting another painful goodbye, but the moment she stepped outside, she stopped completely still. The wagon stood empty beside the fence. No packed supplies, no travel blanket, no cloth bag waiting near the seat. Confused, she walked slowly toward the kitchen doorway, where her wedding shawl rested beneath the warm lantern glow like something no longer connected to humiliation anymore. Caleb's voice came softly from behind her before she touched it. Never liked seeing that thing packed away. Mei Lin turned sharply. Caleb stood near the stable entrance, holding fresh pine boards across one shoulder, looking more nervous now than he ever had around dying horses or angry ranchers. "You healed this place," he said quietly, "not just the animals." Mei Lin tried answering once, but stopped after the first breath. "Bigger crack this time. The kind people cannot hide anymore." Caleb stepped aside slightly afterward and nodded toward the stable. Mei Lin looked up and finally saw the new wooden sign hanging above the restored entrance. Linwood Ranch. Morning sunlight crossed the carved letters while healthy horses shifted calmly inside the same barn she once entered, freezing, abandoned, and unwanted beside dying animals. "You named it after me?" she whispered. Caleb shook his head once. "Named it after what stayed." That answer finally broke the last fear Mei Lin carried through winter, because for the first time in her life, someone was not asking her to remain only until disaster ended. They were asking her to belong after life had already become whole again. What moment made you realize Caleb had already fallen in love with Mei Lin? For me, it was when he unpacked the wagon before sunrise. If you enjoy emotional frontier dramas filled with healing, quiet strength, and unforgettable ranch stories, Subscribe to Echoes of a Rancher for more cinematic Western storytelling every week.